And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network on CAN TV. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and welcome to our program on the secret war in Mexico. And unlike what the title credits said, our guest tonight is Rafael Cervantes of the Justice and Ayotzinapa Committee. Ayotzinapa, for those who don't know, was the scene of an infamous murder of 43 students back in 2014. Students that their case became a lightning rod for all that's been going wrong with the Mexican government and its failure to protect its own people, its corruption. Rafael is active in a number of different groups. We're very proud to have worked with him, for example, in La Voz de los de Abajo, which is a Honduran solidarity group. But tonight we're talking about primarily the secret war in Mexico. And we say secret war because in the United States, those of us who are monolingual English will hear about violence. There was a horrific massacre of, I believe, it was 17 people over 36 hours in Cancun, and that's only made the news because Cancun is a tourist resort where white Americans go. Rafael, could you give us a little background on why the violence in Mexico, what's going on?
I think, I don't know, but I have an idea. First of all, like you said, the secret war is not such a secret. It's not a. It's more of a disguised war. I would say more than that. And the Ayotzinapa case, like you mentioned, represents the fact that this war and whatever the causes of this war are had made the situation very volatile. Now, things like Ayotzinapa can happen. That couldn't probably happen before, and it didn't happen before. There is other cases of disappearances and mass killings, like common grave of 196 immigrants, mostly from Central America, or all of them from Central America, discovered in one of the more violent states recently. It has not been resolved. It has not been, pursued.
Yeah. Well, and there's many stories. For example, a lot of women being murdered around the factories, the maquiladora factories just across the border, and there's no follow-up. In the case of the 43 students, there's pretty clear evidence that the mayor of Ayotzinapa was directly implicated, and there certainly was a cover-up by many levels of the Mexican government.
Exactly. So we can see then that these cases, we're describing, have something in common, and it is impunity.
Yes.
And I think that cuts
whoever does it gets away with it.
Yeah.
Over and over again. Yeah.
And that is from all countries. Honduras is the same situation that our friends and brothers and sisters from there tells us. Impunity, like the case of Berta Cáceres. And in Mexico,
Berta Cáceres was probably the foremost human rights activist in Honduras, who was murdered a few years ago. Yeah.
Exactly. So impunity, and even though there is cases, extraditions, for example, to the U.S. of El Chapo Guzman is in jail somewhere in New York. So even though that gives the appearance that there's some prosecution and investigations, the reality is that there is the people behind the conspirators, the high-level officials that have the power. Are not never.
They're getting away with it. And talking to another activist the other day, I learned for the first time that Mexico has got the highest death rate per capita of any country in the world after Syria. And of course, Syria's had this huge civil war that we keep on hearing about, and yet we're not hearing about what's going on in Mexico with all these deaths. Before we go further in our program on take note that the telephone number at the bottom of your screen there, if you want to call in with a quick question or a quick comment for Raphael or myself or both of us, please call that number. We'll try and get you on the air. That's the 312-738-1060 number. But before we go further in our program, I'd like to bring your attention to a couple of important announcements of events coming up in the next few days. Watch your screens here as I bring up the graphics. What's next for housing justice in Chicago? We have had in the city here a huge problem with homelessness and now with affordability in terms of people not being able to afford housing in the city. And yours truly, as well as a panel of others at a panel hosted by the Democratic Socialists of America, are going to be speaking on this subject next Wednesday, April 18th at the United Electrical Workers Hall, 37 South Ashland Avenue. Thank you very much for Chicago DSA for bringing forth this program. And also coming up on Saturday, April 21st, just 8 days from now, there's a big demonstration against the wars, whether the threat of war on Syria, the threat of nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula, or for that matter, what we're talking about tonight, the secret war in Mexico happening right across our border, and many people in the United States are ignorant about this. We're going to try and be covering those issues and bring attention to them in this demonstration on Saturday, April 21st, 12 noon, beginning at the corner of Michigan Avenue in Congress. But going back to the drug war and so forth, because I was looking up some statistics, and according to the U.S. Bureau of Tobacco, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, 70% of the 104,000 plus arms that were seized in various criminal proceedings in Mexico, 70% of these arms over just a couple-year period came directly from the United States. These are the crimes that we're talking about in Mexico, as if they're quote-unquote Mexican crimes, and yet almost a huge majority of these arms are coming directly from the United States. In Canada, the figure is 98% of firearms involved in crimes that are seized as part of criminal proceedings come from the United States. So the United States can act like, oh, the Mexico, this, that, and the other thing, but the arms are coming right here from the United States. And I think if we probe a little bit further, you have to say, why is it that people get involved in the drugs trade, which bleeds over to violence? And I think you have to say because there aren't other economic alternatives. That one of the most notorious effects of the North American Free Trade Agreement was that now grain from the United States could freely cross the border into Mexico, and this is heavily subsidized agribusiness. This is factory farming that goes across the border into Mexico. It wiped out much of the rural economy in Mexico, as well as when other trade agreements were reached with other parts of Central America. And so a lot of people who had been doing subsistence corn farming, for example, could no longer make a living. And that's when people go into the drugs trade, would be my argument. That when there aren't other economic alternatives, it's no more true that a kid growing up in Chicago or a kid growing up in the rural area of Mexico would go into the drugs trade voluntarily unless there are no other alternatives. People don't want to have a life expectancy of 25 years old or what have you. What are your thoughts on that, Rafael?
If we compare with the past, let's say, in the past, being in the drug trafficking, it was something that you wouldn't think of it. I mean, in most cases, there was no reason to join. And only people that somehow ended up in that belong to cartels, and don't forget that the officials, the police and the army, are always involved
Right.
even here in Chicago.
There's so much money involved in it that it's easy to bribe. Yeah, yeah.
So, years ago, say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was unheard of. I mean, people will not tolerate or go in this. So then comes the crisis, the economic crisis of, I call it the economic crisis of
devaluation of the peso and
liberalism, and the one that we are living right now. When that hits real hard, then is when this desperation comes and people start doing all kinds of stuff that would have not done otherwise, even migrating to the U.S.
Yeah, okay? People don't leave their homes, don't leave everyone they've known, go to a land where they don't know the language unless they're desperate. Exactly. And idiots like Trump, choose to ignore that.
Yeah. So the same, I think, happens with the drug traffic. I think that 10 or 20 years ago, I saw cases of, say, people acquaintance I had here in Chicago or in Mexico, that some family members would get the idea, okay, well, I'm going to make a run and make some money and then quit.
Right, right.
So, and then they face the consequences. They could get caught, or they could.
Or the gangs could bump out the competition.
Exactly, or wouldn't let them out.
Yeah, yeah.
That happens everywhere in these situations. So, but that is different now. Okay. Now is different. Now they go after people, they force them. At the same time, they execute several activities all together. For example, kidnappings, together with trafficking.
Yes, has become big business. Yes,
human trafficking as well as drug trafficking, and there's no transparency even in this war on drugs. So people don't know what the government is doing, if they're doing anything. And there's billions of dollars in the Plan Merida, for example, that are going.
The plan. I'm sorry. Say again.
Plan Merida.
Yeah. To explain what that is, Rafael.
Well, that is. I don't know how to call it in English. Probably an endowment.
Oh, okay.
And that was authorized by the Congress. 1.2. 1.8.
This is a lot of the DEA funding and so forth, the Drug Enforcement Agency.
It used to be called Plan Mexico. It got discredited, and then they
changed the name. Before we go any further, I believe we had a caller. I don't know if our control person has that person still on the line.
Yes. Hello.
Hello. Speak up as much as you can, please, caller.
I certainly will. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please, your question or comment, please.
I certainly do. How you doing? Good evening, sir. Sitting next
to you. Good evening.
I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think about the caravans coming from Mexico? You think they got a chance? They got caravans of busloads of people coming to the United States. You think that's a pretty good idea, sir?
I think it actually is, and here's why. For one thing, this has been an annual event, and Trump is acting like it's something new. And the reason why people caravan is because it's become so dangerous that the governments along the way are very violent and corrupt and taking bribes from drug traffickers and kidnappers and so forth. And so when people come as a group, they're actually safer. And a lot of those folks are just coming to Mexico because it's safer than, for example, in Honduras. But this is a direct result of U.S. policy that the United States, as we mentioned about NAFTA as well as the Central American version, CAFTA, that people are coming El Norte because many of the policies that the United States has instituted in terms of the arms exports, for example, have made things so dangerous in the communities people come from that they feel safer moving, and they move as a group to Mexico.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can, caller.
Okay. I got a question for the man next to you. All these years, Mexico has got the most beautiful vacation places in the world. You got Acapulco, you got Cancun, you got the most beautiful vacation places in the world. What is wrong with your government? I don't seem to understand that. Those vacation places, they thrive. The rest of the country starves. Mexico is a beautiful country. Why doesn't anybody get together and protest against their president? I don't even know who
Caller,
I mean,
let's let Raphael respond here. For one thing, we don't hear about it much in the United States, but there are huge protests, some of which I'll get up on your screen while Raphael answers your question.
So
Go ahead, Raphael.
Let's rephrase the question. The question is why the people in Mexico don't get rid of the corrupt politicians and all of that. Well, I would say that anywhere else in the world is more or less the same situation. Here in the United States, we have a situation of a president that nobody likes, nobody seems to like, and that
What power do we have to get rid of him?
is totally incredible, the stuff that he's come up with.
Well, for that matter, I mean, the caller referenced, a lot of money pouring into these resort areas and not the rest of the country. Look at our own city. Look at what Rahm Emanuel has done to huge areas of the west side and the south side, while the Loop gets, every bell and whistle, and millions of dollars in subsidies, tax monies, and so forth for beautiful bike paths, and they're spending, I believe it's over $10 million just for that silly bike path across the Chicago River downtown. So this is a global problem.
And the profits of these developments, tourism and stuff, are not for Mexicans to share. The profits are extracted out of the country because these hotels are the same chains.
Hilton isn't giving it to Mexicans. Sheraton isn't giving it to Mexicans.
And those are the ones that are also supporting the Mexican politicians, the corruption, and everything else. For example, some of those hotels are built on top of. They destroy the environment and they get permits, and it's incredible.
And there's corruption involved in all that, just as historically there's been corruption in the granting of permits here in Chicago, that you pay the right people or you give legal campaign contributions.
And goes on and on. And what Andy was saying about the agriculture in Mexico was totally destroyed, and companies like Monsanto, for example, are very strong in Mexico, and they're getting stronger, by the way.
I believe we got another caller here. If our person in the control room, Paul, can maybe get that second person in.
Yes, I wanted to make a couple of points with regard to...
Okay, make it very brief, sir, because we're towards the end of our show here, okay?
Okay. Oh, one, I think the gentleman raises an important point, because what happens internally in Mexico has a direct effect in terms of the issues that we discuss when it comes to issues like immigration and so forth. Because when you have a stable society, thriving economy, there is less of a desire on the part of that population to emigrate to another country.
Absolutely.
No one says, I'm going to risk my life and my family and cross the border and live somewhere illegally, unless they're forced to. And let's admit this to ourselves. We've had a lot of pull in this country. Messages that were sent to people living in Mexico that said, come here, we'll look the other way, and you'll work for a lower wage for a lot of Fortune 500 companies. And for many years, we allowed that to happen. And then all of a sudden, we want to say to these people, oh, by the way, now we want to push you out. I mean, we can't talk out of both sides of our mouth.
Yeah. Well, thank you, caller. Raphael, would you care to respond?
You know,
It was very difficult to understand you, sir. Unfortunately, the sound sometimes isn't terribly good here in the studio. I certainly agree with your first point about people don't voluntarily leave their home and all their friends and their relatives just on a lark. There's a huge push, and we see that here in the city of Chicago. I mean, people leaving the city of Chicago, people are leaving the city because the policies of our mayor and big business have made it so miserable in some areas of our city for people to live, as libraries, schools, mental health centers, everything has been defunded. And the situation here in Chicago is actually relatively good compared to some places, for example, in Honduras, in terms of the violence and the poverty, and yet some people are leaving Chicago, and it's very sad. But on one level, who can blame them? One basic point that I wanted to make, that I think is very important here. We talked a lot of the problems and some of the symptoms and where those symptoms come, but I think there's a real basic issue here, that when you've got drug wars going on, when you've got people who feel like there's no way to make a living except for get involved in the illegal economy, this is a failure of capitalism. People don't go into these different illegal trades because it's great. It's because the mainstream economy has failed them. Think of Depression-era Chicago and the rat-a-tat-tat, Al Capone and so forth, all the crime, the corruption that we saw that is now legendary. This was a result of the failure of capitalism in Depression-era Chicago, that people went into these various illegal trades that were very lucrative compared to the straight economy. And all that money then floods into politics, and you have mayors and aldermen bought off. That's why the Mexican government is so unbelievably corrupt. I mean, we've seen it here in the history of our own city. So rather than getting this sort of racist trope about those people and their corruption and their violence, let's point a mirror on the history of our own city and see that in eras of crisis, when capitalism does not deliver good jobs for youth, when people don't feel like they've got any money that they're going to be able to get their health care or their retirement or whatever, that's when the illegal economy flourishes. That's when drug wars start and so forth, and that's when we have this huge amounts of violence. So, Raphael, we've just got a couple minutes. I want you to have the last word here, please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having us here. Not the last word, but the last thoughts for today are interesting. That I'm thinking for the 21st.
Yes,
it is interesting.
That's the big demonstration coming.
It's
yes.
an anti-war demonstration, and we have to convince everybody that this war is happening in Mexico, while millions of people that migrated from Mexico live in the United States. So it is a very important war for the U.S. for the American public to keep an eye on, and so I'm very happy that we're going to participate on that. The other things is that the volatility of the situation, you can expect anything now because it is volatile. So it might not be there might not be a cause, like in Cancun you're saying, there's no cause, it's just volatile. And I was reading the news in Mexico are different than the news over here. There's Chicago is airing
There's a big trial going on. Raphael was telling us before the show, those of us who are monolingual, such as myself, tell us about this trial and what's going on here.
Well, it's a trial of some extradited narco-traffickers from Mexico, and the trial has been here for quite a long time.
In federal court, right downtown Chicago.
So in some of the documents, they were discovered by one of the news agencies in Mexico. It shows that there was a communication between drug people here in Chicago and in Iguala on September 26, when the Ayotzinapa students, teacher students.
So we may be finally getting to the bottom of who was at the top of the killing chain of the 43 students.
If that fact would keep the case open, because the government in Mexico wants to to shut it down.
This is a case that has brought probably tens of thousands of people into the streets of Mexico City and elsewhere around the country. We don't hear about it in the United States if we're English-only folk because our news doesn't cover it. But people in Mexico have been protesting against their own government and the corruption and the drug gangs and so forth far more than we have here in the United States.
And the refusal of the Mexican government to follow suggestions and directives made by very important offices of say the Organization of American States through the Human Rights Commission. So the government refuses. The government then insists on their own, and then we hear this news that contradict their official historical, we call it, version, and so we wonder why do they cover? Why do they do it? Because we'll find out more about the truth, more about the secrets.
Okay, and I'm afraid we're going to have to be wrapping up the show here really quick. I just want to give you some information about some stuff that's coming up. Again, what's next for housing justice in Chicago, sponsored by the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. This coming Wednesday at the UE Hall, 7 p.m., 37 South Ashland. And of course, the big demonstration that Raphael just mentioned, Stop the Wars, Saturday, April 21st at Michigan in Congress at 12 noon. And with that, I'd like to thank Rafael Cervantes for helping us out tonight and all the other folks who made tonight's program possible.